Well, it is just such a great day. Dan makes fun of me, I guess, for saying it's such a beautiful day. Well, and I'll say it's a spectacularly resplendent day. Is that better, Dan? I just like sunshine. I'm a big fan of sunshine. I don't know if it's growing up in Portland, Oregon all those years and my body was like deprived of vitamin D and just had that cumulative effect on me or something, but I like sunshine, and sunshine reminds me of God's light shining on us. So it is a beautiful day. I'm glad that you're here. If you're a visitor especially, please know that you are welcome among us. Your questions are welcome. Your participation is welcome. If you have any questions at all, just tell us. We'd love to open up our Bibles together with you and talk about whatever it is of a spiritual nature that's on your mind. Now, I have very intentionally attached this lesson to what I talked about at 9 o'clock. If you were not here at 9 o'clock, I encourage you to listen to that at some point this week as a complement to what we're talking about right now. But there's a story in Luke chapter 16 that Jesus tells of this unrighteous steward who squanders his master's wealth, and he's caught red-handed doing it. And the man, through several acts of cleverness, is able to provide for himself some security in his future. And Jesus, while criticizing the unrighteousness of the act itself, nevertheless says, I give him credit for being clever, that he is acting with shrewdness in relation to people like him. More shrewdly, by the way, than the sons of light tend to act. Now, at the end of that story in Luke 16, Jesus makes a statement that we see echoed again back in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, where he talks about wealth and the kind of faith that we put in it. And Jesus is very clear in verse 24 of Matthew 6. Again, this is a parallel to Luke 16. In Matthew 6, verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll hold to one and despise the other. And so you cannot serve both God and earthly things. He uses the word mammon there. That just means earthly wealth. So about a month and a half ago, I did part one of just what I anticipate is just going to be a two-part series on the subject of addiction. And we looked at some of the big picture things on addiction, kind of the physiological basis for addiction, why it is that our brains are designed in such a way to want what we want, and how it is that addictive practices and substances actually damage that system within our brain, that it sort of ruins the wiring inside of our brains. And I said that part two, when I got to it in a month or two, was going to deal with more of the application of that. Like, what does that look like in real life, especially for the Christian striving to live by what Jesus says? You cannot serve two masters. And if you find yourself addicted to something, then you are trying to serve two masters. You have one foot in God's camp while at the same time another foot firmly planted in the things of this world, the fleshly behavior that so easily entangles and defeats us. So we'll start in this lesson the same place I started last time, which is in 2 Peter 2, verse 19. For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. And I know that you may be saying, yeah, but I'm not an addict. And this is the same slide I had up in part one. I'm not going to re-preach all of part one. Don't worry. You're going like, this is oddly familiar. But I want to go back to this slide to reiterate the point that I made a month and a half ago, which is maybe you can pat yourself on the back and say, oh, I've never had a sip of alcohol, never smoked a cigarette, never dragged a thing, sniffed a thing, snorted a thing. I am not an addict. So this lesson is clearly not for me. Okay. But let's take a step away from that kind of conventional definition of addiction and look at it more through the lens of what Peter tells us in 2 Peter 2. If you're overcome by anything, if there is anything in your life that controls you beyond God, then I don't know how you can argue you're not, at least in some sense, addicted. And there's a lot of addictions out there, by the way, that fly under the radar. Okay, good for you. You never snorted anything. You never shot up. You never drank it. I get good for you. And let me tell you, don't do those things. Don't. And I do think that I'm about to add an extra point. This isn't in the notes or in the material or anything, but here's Ryan already getting off track. It's okay, because it's a point that I think is really worth making. In part one, I pointed out, and this is not me patting myself on the back, absolutely not. I want to be clear about that. But I didn't ever drink, have never drunk, have never smoked anything, have never partaken of the drug. Okay? I think our young people need to know that both stories are valuable. You know, somebody might get up and say, I did do all of those things. That was me in my youth. I did smoke everything, drink everything. I indulged in that life and I saw the worst of it. And look what God can do, pulling people out of that darkness. That's an important story for people to know. You need to know that no matter how far you've gone or how bad it's gotten, Jesus can pull you out. You need to know that story. And again, this is not patting myself on the back. I don't want it to come across that way. But I do think young people also need to know that you don't have to hit rock bottom. It is actually possible for you to get out of your youth having never smoked it, having never drunk it, it's possible. You can do that. Like that is possible. I think we almost have like a defeatist attitude about stuff like that. Like, well, you know, you're 17, 18, 19 years old, going away to college. It's inevitable. You got to sow your wild oats. Everyone has to do it. No, you don't. You don't. There's nothing that requires you to do that. So both stories, I think, have value. Both stories have value. Now, where were we actually in our lesson? Oh, yeah. But I'm no addict. Well, okay, let's talk about some of these things. And I already hit on them pretty hard in part one, so we'll go through them pretty quickly. What about sports betting and gambling? Yeah, but I'm not addicted to it. Are you? And even if you weren't addicted, in, again, a technical, like textbook definition of addiction, I think there's a lot of things that could be said about gambling and sports betting and what it does to our lives, what it says to our children, what it says to our neighbors. Okay, what about social media, screen time, gaming, video games? Whew, boy, I don't know. Rebecca got me a book the other day, and she said, well, don't worry, I'm going to read it too, so don't think I'm judging you here. But it's 12 ways your phone is changing you. And it's all about the psychology. It's all about the psychology of what screen time does to us, right? Our brains, our ability to relate to each other, habits that are formed. And so I've actually been trying really hard lately. And I'll tell you what, it is really hard. Shannon inspired me, by the way. She inspired me. She got rid of Facebook on her phone. And you know what? I did the same thing. I'm going to tell you something. It's been 2 weeks. Haven't missed it. I'm telling you, haven't missed it. I have to remind myself when I'm on an actual computer. I have to remind myself I better go check Facebook twice a week or whatever it is. You really don't miss it once you get used to it. But I think there's something to be said about our social media and our screen time usage. If that's dominating your life, if that's controlling you, I don't see how 2 Peter 2 doesn't apply. By what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. Risky behaviors. And in part one, I mentioned things like ever-increasing risk that you attach to things like, well, I'm not just going to go whitewater rafting because I've done that. I'm going to go whitewater rafting without a life jacket on this time. And then I'm going to go whitewater rafting, and I'm not going to tell people. I'm not going to let my wife know that I'm out there. I'm going to go hiking by myself without any water through the woods. I'm not going to tell anybody where I'm at. I think we have this kind of this addiction that we have to the next high, the next endorphin rush. And I think that can be addictive also. Shopping, spending money, especially when you're shopping as a coping mechanism for some kind of trauma in your life. Instead of confronting the trauma, whatever it is, instead of confronting it and dealing with it, working through it, you just fill the hole with stuff. You buy things. You're on Amazon all the time and you're spending money. Prescription drug abuse. And I said in part one, someone called me out one time and said, Ryan, you preach these lessons on social drinking. You hammer social drinking all the time. How come you don't hammer prescription drug abuse the way you do social drinking? I think that's a good question. Why don't we? Why don't we talk about it a little bit more? And I think also, quite uncomfortably, obsessive sexual behaviors and fetishes also can become an addictive trap that we fall into in our marriages, where we're constantly pushing our spouse to do ever stranger things, things that are embarrassing or humiliating or dehumanizing. And it's like we get bored with this over here, and so we're always pushing those boundaries in our sexual relationship with our spouse. And again, that I think can be just as addictive as anything else. So, with our lesson today, I want to talk about a few spiritual and practical applications to the idea of addiction, how addiction impacts us in our lives, and also some of the arguments that people make in defense of their addictive behaviors. And we'll start with this one. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right. I mean, we kind of, sometimes we have this attitude toward addictive substances and behaviors, and we say, well, gambling is just a form of entertainment. I mean, as long as you're on the right side of the state line, I mean, it's just a form of entertainment. Well, I only drink in moderation. I mean, and I never, ever would drive drunk. You'd never catch me driving. I just drink in moderation. Listen, everybody needs to eat, right? Sex is a natural part of being a human, and how we express ourselves sexually is just, it's just part of our animal instincts. Marijuana is being legalized in a number of states, so clearly it must be safe. We make these kinds of arguments that something is legal, therefore it's okay. But there's a lot of things that are legal that are not okay. There's a lot of things that are legal and have been legal in almost every civilization for thousands of years, but that doesn't make them okay. And it kind of shocks me when people lean into this argument. Remember, the Bible says in 2 Peter 2:19, and we're going to come back to this over and over and over again, for by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. And that says nothing of the legality of that behavior. Other passages as well. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. I know that we're familiar with this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the apostle makes a very, very powerful statement here about the way that he governed his own behavior. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 12, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. Chapter 10 and verses 23 and 24, similarly, Paul remarks here in 1 Corinthians 10, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. So let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. You could also add verse 31 to that as well. Whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God. Now, I get it. You can point to a lot of stuff and say, so you're telling me you got to tie your shoes to the glory of God. You're telling me you got to wax your eyebrows to the glory of God. You got to mow your lawn to the glory of God. I understand that if we're not careful, we can apply that statement in a really ridiculous way. But I will challenge you. I will challenge you on a lot of these things. That if you look at your behavior on Friday night out with your coworkers in that place with those people doing that thing, I will challenge you. Are you doing all things to the glory of God? And the way you speak to your spouse and what you ask your spouse to do and how far you push those boundaries. Well, honey, why don't you ever do this? How come you don't ever do that? It's a real simple request. Are you doing that to the glory of God? And how you treat your body and what you put into your body. Are you doing that to the glory of God? That's a very challenging statement that Paul makes there. We need to stop justifying our addictions simply because they don't come with jail time. There are a myriad of consequences to addiction that cannot be measured in fines or prison sentences or legal fees. And I think one thing to keep in mind also is your employer. Employers are becoming more and more aware of our activities on social media. And employers have every right to terminate an employee for conduct that they find disruptive, lazy, risky, harmful, not illegal. Now, I ragged on John Morant in the lesson at 9 a.m. I really don't intend on piling on because he's had a really, really bad couple of weeks. But you know, a lot of what's coming out about John Morant's behavior, especially last summer and some of his interactions with, people in our community, a lot of what's coming out, like, if you've got a good lawyer, that's never going to stick, right? It's never going to hurt him, legally speaking. But you do look at some of that behavior and some of the choices and you go, I get that you're not going to go to jail for that, but don't think for a moment that's not going to have long-term consequences on how people view you, how people look up to you, what kind of money you get from Nike, Powerade. Like, okay, I get it. If you have a good enough lawyer, that stuff's not going to stick. But don't think for a minute that's not going to come with consequences. In addition, I think many addicts try to dismiss their particular addiction by contrasting it with something that appears far worse. They say, well, at least I'm not doing this. I mean, they may make some statement about marijuana, for example. Well, I would never use a hard drug. So, take that for what it's worth. But I will say, in the studying that I've done on addiction and addictive substances, in the studying and the reading that I've done and talking to people who have experienced it, it is amazing that even in the world of addicts, there are lines, like these kind of artificial lines that addicts won't cross. And I have heard myself, well, I use marijuana, but I would never use hard drugs. I take pills, but I would never inject. All right, and there's these lines, these artificial lines that they created. Well, I would never cross that line. At least I'm not this. At least I don't do that. Even in the world of porn, people try to make those artificial distinctions, and they are artificial. Well, I just don't see what the problem is with a little bit of harmless, casual porn use. And is there really such a thing? Well, listen, I may look at porn, but I would never look at porn that involved children or violence. Well, I guess good for you. I mean, good for you, so I guess you're not going to go to prison because of the porn that you look at, but you're saying then that as long as you don't cross that artificial line, there's no consequences, it has no negative impact on me, it won't destroy various aspects of my life. These are artificial distinctions that we make so that we can feel better about the addiction that is ruling our lives. At least I'm not that guy over there. Okay, a second argument now that people sometimes throw out there kind of in defense of their addictive behaviors and substances is, well, this is just bringing out my best. You know, because of this thing, you're getting the real Ryan. I mean, you're full of stress. You had a long work week. You got to blow off some steam. And until you've had a couple of drinks, you're not really getting the real you. Get a little loosened up, a little lathered up, and you finally get funny Ryan. By the way, I've never been drunk. I don't know what kind of drunkard I'd be, but you're running the risk, by the way, and I'm not saying this is a joke at all. You run the risk of, you either become funny Ryan or you become raging temper Ryan. And I think hey, you got to have a couple of drinks to loosen up. Or that turns into you got to have a couple of drinks so that you can go commit sexual harassment. And I just feel like you're getting your best, huh? Couple of drinks in your system. You're going to get are you really going to get your best? People say, well, I'm not addicted. I just use it to help me get through life. I just need it to help me manage my stress. But in the long run, addiction leads to destruction. So any of the temporary enhancements that you enjoy from that addiction are always counterbalanced, if not fully neutralized, by the long-term consequences. Let me tell you something. The very best version of you is never going to be found in addiction. The high might be great, but the coming paranoia, fear, obsession, and physical malaise is not worth it. The net result is always that you are still you, and your problems are still your problems. You just got to ignore them for a while. But you come out of the high, you come out of the inebriation, you come out of the porn usage, and guess what? That broken relationship is still facing you. That stress at work is still there. That deep, gaping spiritual hole you've been keeping God at arm's length all these years is still a deep, gaping spiritual hole. Notice the way that Paul contrasts in Ephesians chapter 2, life before and life after Christ. Ephesians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, and I know that he's not talking about addiction here. I understand that. But really, we're talking about the spiritual and practical world of addiction. We're not talking about the physiological side of it necessarily in all of these points. But really, you can look at Ephesians chapter 2 and you see the world of the addict here. The hopelessness, the vanity of it all, the emptiness of it. It's a dead-end road. We were dead in our trespasses and sins. He begins in Ephesians chapter 2. You were dead. It was dead end. It wasn't going anywhere. In which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that's now working the sons of disobedience. In them we too all formerly lived in the lusts of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as ours. I'm telling you, verse 3, that is the definition of addiction. You were living in lust, so that's sexual addictions. The desires of the flesh, these are physical addictions, food, drink, drugs. And we're by nature children of wrath. The nature there is a learned nature. We were by nature as in we learned it. It became habit. That's not nature as in design or by birth. That's nature by learned habit, a second nature that you learn because of choices. That's the addiction right there. And yet verse 4 says, God, being rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Christ. For by grace you've been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Of course, there's more to be said from Ephesians 2, but that is a lesson all its own. Without Christ, whether you're an addict or not, without Christ, you are dead in your sins, and you follow the desires both the flesh and mind. Well, other people argue it's always someone else's fault. I'm only addicted because of this. I'm only addicted because you drove me to that addiction. I'm only addicted because you refused me what I wanted. I'm only addicted because if they hadn't prescribed such a strong medication from the start, I never would have become addicted. It's always someone else's fault. My father, my mother, my doctor, my wife, my job, my boss. Society drove me to this. It is always someone else's fault. Now let's understand that all these things might be true in some sense. And maybe your father failed you. And he failed you so badly that your father, because of abuse in the home, your father kicked the door wide open for you to also fall for the same traps. And maybe it is true that your doctor shot from the hip and prescribed you something that was way too strong for the physical condition that you were going through. And it may be true that in your marriage, you're struggling in your romance. And in a state of deprivation, you have justified your porn use. Those things might all be true. They might all be true. But I have a really, really hard time with anybody who removes the personal responsibility aspect. Ultimately, you had a choice to make somewhere along the way. And I have a problem with that. Now, I feel sympathy for the person. And in the end, the choice is not about just not wanting the drug, not wanting the sex. That's not the choice. It's not that choice, like you can either want it or not want it. The choice is you're always going to want it. If you're addicted to something, you're probably always going to want it on some level. So that's not the choice we're talking about. The choice is, what am I doing over here that helps keep me from the compromise over here? Who are the people that I'm with? What are the settings that I'm finding myself in? What are the precursors to the addictive behavior? And can I make a choice? Because I probably am never going to stop wanting the thing I'm addicted to. I think the goal is, don't ever put yourself in a position where you're going to fail when the want comes. And so we move on to this other point, which is to find the godliness and contentment that is offered to us in Jesus Christ. I like in 1 Timothy chapter 6, godliness, he says, actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. The inspired author in that passage is contrasting this contentment with those who believe they can gain contentment through other means, like earthly wealth. And those who want to get rich and those who want to make it their life's pursuit are only going to be found and left with an emptiness and a pierced soul. Now the addict, regardless of what his drug of choice happens to be, discovers that his desire for more and more and more always leads, like 1 Timothy 6 verse 9, always leads to ruin and destruction. But the godly person learns, in Philippians chapter 4, 11 through 13, learns to be content in every circumstance. This is a powerful thing there, that contentment is something that you have to learn. You have to learn how to be content. And that's hard enough as it is without an addiction getting in the way. Imagine facing an addiction and having to relearn different pathways to get back to that same level of contentment. You have to learn to be content. It is a learned state. It is something that must be practiced. An addict's only concern is getting more, which means the addiction is always in control. He's always at the mercy of his drug, and his contentment level is always fluctuating depending on whether or not he's had a hit. And so the apostle is saying in the scriptures in Philippians chapter 4 that he learned how to disconnect his contentment level from his physical circumstances, so that whether he had food in his belly or his belly was screaming for a meal, contentment was disconnected from that physical state. Whether he was in a prison or he was walking free, contentment was disconnected from that state. That is hard for us. But it requires us to see a delineation between the physical and the spiritual. Physical fluctuates. Old, young, strong, weak, hungry, full, rich, poor, on top of things, or buried under everybody else. The physical fluctuates. I like the statement that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 6. He says there in that same context that we all read in 1 Corinthians 6, 12 through 13, I'm going to keep reading there. All things are lawful for me. We've already read that. I will not be mastered by anything. He says food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food. But God will do away with both of those things. Yet the body is not for immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. He says, separate those things. Draw a line between those things. Food is for the stomach. That's all it is. It goes in the stomach, it's digested, and it's gone. That can't be where your joy comes from. That can't be where your joy... Are you seriously saying that your joy comes from the money you earn at your job, and that joy comes from the however many seconds it is that you enjoy that sexual experience, and that joy comes from the food that you're eating that's digested and turned into waste after that? You're telling me that's where your joy is coming from. Paul says you have to disconnect joy and contentment from those physical things. Your next step, therefore, may be the hardest one of all. And I'm clear with you. I think I've been clear with you through this whole thing that I am not an expert. I'm not a therapist. I'm not going to psychoanalyze you. I'm your Christian brother. And I hope that if you come talk to me about what you're going through in your life, that I can give you good godly advice and direct you. If what you need is medical help, help from a therapist, help with a recovery program, if you come talk to me, I'll do my very best as your Christian brother to love you and direct you to the resources that you need. Please, if you're struggling with addiction in any way whatsoever, please talk to me. And if you want to be anonymous, leave me a note. If you don't want anybody else involved, that's fine. Nobody has to know we're talking. Please come talk to me. Ideally, we should be preventing the initial spiritual problems that lead to addiction in the first place, which is dissatisfaction, jealousy, boredom, anxiety, rebellion, and those sorts of things. But when addiction does take hold, there is no easy answer and there is no religious silver bullet. Stop making excuses and seek help. And I'll tell you what, you might be very surprised when you do reach out for help. You might be very surprised at the hands that reach out and help you. Because there are heroes in this room right now. Warriors who've been in the same trench that you are. Allies that will stand at your side and help you get through this. And I think that you will be shocked. I think you would be very, very shocked at some of the people who come up to you and say, listen, I was there 10 years ago. I was there 6 months ago. Let's get through this together. Now, we'd be remiss if we didn't also appeal to the great spiritual need that we all have. We all need Jesus Christ, addict or not. And so I want to encourage you that if you have any other spiritual need, if you need our help in some way, if you need us to pray for you and to be with you through a rough time, or if you know what you need to do by the message of the gospel to become a Christian, which is to believe and be baptized for the remission of your sins, then we can help you with that too. So whatever spiritual need you have, please let that need be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.
Yeah.